here in Louisiana
That's right.
has been in the tourism and the cultural industries. I also spent some time in state government at the Louisiana Office of Cultural Development. Worked as well in international relations in the Lieutenant Governor's office. I worked at the French consulate in New Orleans, and I was also the director of Codefil, which is Louisiana's French language agency. And in my everyday life, I've been associated with the project at Laura Plantation, which is there behind me, which was really a huge introduction into this whole idea of rethinking these perspectives on Louisiana history, the people, and the places, because we talk about Louisiana as a former French colony, and we talk about Acadians who became Cajuns, but Louisiana is a whole lot more than that. And in the larger history of Louisiana, the Acadians actually occupy a smaller place than they have now in the mythology surrounding Louisiana. I say that myself as a descendant of Acadians who arrived in Louisiana in 1785 after having spent 25 years in exile in France. My first French ancestors arrived in Louisiana in 1716 at the very beginning of the colonial period. So I have both European French ancestry and Acadian ancestry. I guess we'll just jump into this. And as Eric mentioned, you can put comments or questions in the chat. This is a presentation that is actually a combination of a number of them that I've done over the years. This Rethinking Perspectives on Louisiana History, People, and Places was presented actually to a group of teachers from abroad who teach in Louisiana immersion schools, so to give them some better insights into the diversity of the people and the diversity of French languages in the plural and French Creole languages in the plural that exist in Louisiana. So we'll just go ahead and jump on in. Let's see if I can get this to advance. I mentioned these places where I have worked, Laura Plantation, which is where I was actually today, the Office of Cultural Development, the French Consulate General, and Codefil. So I want you to think about Louisiana as always having been a carrefour. It's always been a crossroads of people. Obviously, in the beginning, there were indigenous people. The first quote unquote French explorers who came to Louisiana were actually Canadiens. Many of them had never actually been to France. Then there's a European immigration here during the colonial period, and there are lots and lots and lots of Africans. This presentation is taken from lots of different sources. This is a list of the books that I recommend people read to get a better understanding about what this mosaic of peoples looks like. These are academic studies. They are novels, they are poetry, they are personal memoirs of this story of Louisiana taken from different perspectives and different people looking at again this mosaic of people that were in this place during the colonial period, through the American period, and even still today. Uh, when we talk about Louisiana as a French colony, that's an administrative term. Who was actually here? Well, there was a huge diversity of people. There were Native Americans, there were French Canadians, there were French, there were Senegambians who were brought here as enslaved people, there were Germans, there were Belgians and Swiss people in the 18th century. Louisiana, for nearly 40 years, was a Spanish colony administratively. So there were some Spanish immigrations into Louisiana. There was an Acadian immigration that happened between 1764 and 85. There was a huge influx of people from Saint-Domingue, which is now Haiti, after the transfer. Actually, in 1809, 1810, the population of the city of New Orleans doubled, thanks to these refugees, both white, free people of color, and enslaved people who came to New Orleans. And there were various others. 1803 is a pretty critical time period for us because that's when Louisiana is sold by Napoleon to the United States. Keeping in mind, there's already a huge mosaic of people here. And that's when we see the emergence of a Creole identity in Louisiana in opposition to American identity. Our perception of this term Creole today generally focuses on people of mixed racial ancestry. Historically, that was not the case. Creoles were simply people born in the colony who spoke French, Creole, Spanish, and who were Roman Catholic. They were not American. They did not consider themselves to be American. Americans were English speaking Protestants. And that division in those identity lines actually persisted up until the early decades of the 20th century. New Orleans was actually a city that was literally divided by a street with a French city on one side and an American city on the other, up until 1853. And then we have the Civil War and Reconstruction period, imagining Louisiana as an occupied space by the Union Army, the Reconstruction period, and things shifted drastically during this time period of the post-Civil War. And when public education was made mandatory in 1916, all of the children did not go to the same schools, and the schools were segregated for white children, black children, and much later Native children. And it was in these segregated English-only schools, because English is imposed as the only language of public education in 1921, that all of these French and Creole-speaking children from white, black, and indigenous backgrounds were forced to redefine themselves as American. And this forced assimilation and heritage language loss obviously led to a shift in identity. And that is when we began to see, much later in the 1960s and the 1970s, this bifurcation of these two groups, where now we consider Creoles to be quote unquote black and Cajuns to be quote unquote white. So there are lots of political and social things that are happening that makes that actually manifest, as I said, in the late 1960s and early 1970s. We can get into a little bit more of that later, but I just wanted to lay the groundwork for you of what the space looks like during that time period. As I mentioned, French colony administratively with a heavily African population that in many ways remains invisibilized in the collective conscious and the popular perception and tourism promotion. This is cobbled together also from a presentation that a colleague and I did for the New Orleans Tour Guide Association, so that they can have a better understanding about how to tell this story when they're talking to visitors doing their tours of the French Quarter and in other parts of the city. I just wanted to bring this up as well. In 1795, there was a population of 19,926 human beings that were held in slavery in Louisiana. There were 16,304 free people of color. So these are Afro-descended who are not enslaved, who are speaking French and Creole. But comparatively, the Acadians numbered only 3,000 exiles who arrived over a period of 21 years. So there were 10 times more people of African descent in Louisiana in the 18th century than there were Acadians. So 10 times more Black people than Acadians in Louisiana in the 18th century. This, I forget exactly where I sourced this, but this also gives you an idea about who is in what regions of Louisiana, these different parishes. So you can see that there is the number of whites, there's the number of enslaved people, and there's also the number of free people of color. And you can see that in many places, the number of Africans actually outnumbers the number of white people. This is really important when we talk about language in Louisiana, because if you consider that in the places where, and especially in the plantation spaces along the Mississippi River, when we talk about the planter families, the white families who are running these plantations, there are many less white people than there are Africans on these farms. Sometimes there can be 90% more Africans than there are white people on the plantation. And who's bringing up the children? So the common language in these spaces is not French. It's actually going to be Creole. And even among the very, very elite white families in Louisiana as we move into the late 18th and into the American period. In most cases, Creole is going to be the maternal language of the white children because they're being brought up by enslaved women in these plantation spaces. And they don't actually begin to study or learn French until they are schooled. Some of our greatest Louisiana writers from the 19th century actually mention that in the prefaces to their novels and to their studies and things like that, that they did not learn French until they began their educations. Um, Vacherie is a town in St. James Parish where Laura Plantation is situated. And because I work in a plantation space and I'm constantly trying to make people more aware of this African presence, I want you to mention to just look at this sign, which was put up in 1962, and notice who is not mentioned there. So we have Native people mentioned, we have Canadians, we have French, the Germans, the Acadians, and the Spaniards, but there is no mention of Africans on this sign. And they were 73% of the population of the uh, parish of St. James in the 19th century. So, this question of who's here, invisibilization, and how that manifests itself in the narratives that we have been told and the things that we think about Louisiana. In New Orleans, I mentioned the city was divided in two. So if you guys are driving down the interstate where you are, that piece in the middle, a grassy piece, you call that the median. Well, we actually call that the neutral ground. And that is because Canal Street, which you see in the middle of this image, was the first quote unquote neutral ground, which divided on the downriver side. So everything on the right that you see on that image is downriver. Everything upriver, the Mississippi River, is English speaking. So Canal Street divided the city basically in two. And it was not until 1853 that New Orleans would be consolidated under a single municipality, and where government services would then be delivered in both languages. But historically, everything happens in French on one side and everything happens in English on the other. I use oftentimes the comparison or the metaphor of going to New York and going to Chinatown. You walk across the street and everything is in a different language. All of the signage is in a different language. Well, New Orleans looked like that once upon a time as well. We don't today have any physical reminders of that or any audible or visual reminders of what that looked like. So our benchmarks for trying to understand this have completely shifted. But once upon a time, donc si l'on traversait la rue dans le Vieux Carré, on parlait français et il était parlé créole et tout. And we'd cross the other street, the side to the other side, and there we would be speaking English. We come back a lot and talk about this. There's this constant endless debate about what does Creole mean. And you will find lots of definitions of that. And most people will settle on some, well, Creole is a culture. Creole is all of this blending of influences and things like that. In a 19th century context and even early 20th century context, it's a lot easier to say what Creoles are not. Creoles are not Americans, because Americans for Creoles are English-speaking Protestants. And there are still some elderly people in Louisiana for whom French or Creole were their first languages, who will talk about English speakers as Américains. So again, we don't really have that concept anymore down here of Americans being the other, but in a historic context, Americans were othered in Louisiana as English-speaking Protestants by the French-speaking Catholics. We often are asked who still speaks French or Creole in Louisiana. There is no way to have a real number because of the way that the census is worded. So the U.S. Census asked, what is the principal language spoken in the household? And if you have 3 people or 4 people in the house, and one person speaks French and the other don't, that person is not counted because French is not the primary language spoken in the household. So French speakers and Creole speakers are completely invisibilized in the way that the census questions are asked. And we would have to do a door-to-door survey. We'd also have to figure out some kind of barometer to measure in some way who speaks French. And if we allow people to self-identify, do they really speak French? And what does it mean to speak French? Does it mean that you can say, hello, my name is Joseph? Does it mean that you can talk about the weather? Does it mean that you can talk about politics? Like, what are the barometers for determining who speaks French if they self-identify? So our estimates today are around 100,000 people who can have a fluent conversation in French about many different subjects. Creole was a much more marginalized language that came to be associated mostly with the very poor and Afro-descended people. So it was not a prestige language, and so it was not considered as quote unquote savable or preservationable as French has been. And so the number of Creole speakers today in Louisiana is estimated to be less than 10,000, most of them very, very elderly. I will say, though, that there has been a resurgence of interest in the Louisiana Creole language over the last 10 years or so. And there are now virtual communities online where you have people who are reappropriating the Louisiana Creole language. And these are not only Afro-descended people, they are also white identified people whose families spoke Creole as their first language, whose grandparents spoke Creole. So it's very confusing for lots of people because now today there are people who are self-identified as white or self-identified as Cajun, but the language they speak is actually Creole. So again, we'd have to be having a conversation with people to really determine what language they're speaking. Is it Louisiana French or is it Louisiana Creole? I mentioned this idea of segregated schools that happened in 1916 a few minutes ago, and this is really an important thing to understand. Institutional segregation has a lot to do with the demise and the loss of Louisiana heritage languages, because when you had this segregation happening, Native children did not have access to high school education after 8th grade until 1964. So white people and Black people were assimilated much more quickly by the 1921 Constitution, which made English the only language of public education, because before that, it was possible to go to school in French in Louisiana. But because Native people were more segregated than Afro-descended people were, again, they don't have access to high school education until 1964, they were able to maintain their French for a generation or two longer than white people or Black people were. And what's really interesting is that if you really want to hear or go into a community where everybody is speaking French in Louisiana today, it's with the Native people. It's not with people who identify as Cajun or Creole. It's mostly Native people who've been able to carry and maintain this language. And it's very paradoxical and interesting because it's because of racial segregation and institutional segregation that they were able to maintain their French. 1921, again, is when a new state constitution is voted. And this says that the general exercises in the public school shall be conducted in the English language. Again, before 1921, there were French language schools in Louisiana. But then now you have all of these kids going to these schools who don't speak English, and they're going to be forced to learn to speak English. At this point, French is going to be relabeled a foreign language. And what's fascinating is that we still talk about French as a foreign language in Louisiana, right? So if your kids going to school and you're going to ask them, so what foreign language are you taking? Some of the wording has shifted in educational settings to world languages, but in general conversation, everyday people are just going to call it a foreign language, even though for many of these people, that's the language that their parents or their grandparents spoke as their first language. So it's interesting to look at how assimilation into English and loss of heritage languages has also shifted our perception and relationship to these languages now as a foreign. Um, and we, I started myself really hammering this idea of heritage language instead of foreign language back about 10 or 15 years ago. And I'm pleased to see that other people who do this work have also begun to use that term and to really talk about French and Creole as heritage languages as opposed to foreign languages, because that makes them more accessible. We don't talk about gumbo as a foreign food. We don't talk about Mardi Gras as a foreign holiday. We don't talk about jazz as foreign music. So why should we talk about the languages in which those cultural elements were developed and were born and developed in Louisiana as a foreign language? It just doesn't make sense. So again, the consequences of that is that French is relabeled a foreign language. Reprogrammation in English to Americanize everybody is going to give us a huge décalage relationnel vis-à-vis du français. So now you have people who talk about Louisiana French and Louisiana Creole as broken languages or only oral languages that will really focus on how, quote unquote, different these varieties of French or Creole are from what we call normative French or standard French. And there's a whole litany of myths that were created specifically to forcibly assimilate people and to create this distance with the language and to create a new relationship to it. What's interesting, again, also is to look at some of these people like Alfred de Mercier, who was a first language Creole speaker, who says, and this is sort of truncated and summarized, le jour où on ne parle plus français en Louisiane, il n'y aura plus de créole. So what this means is that for him, this French language was central to Louisiana Creole identity. And if we look at places like Acadie or Quebec or French language minority groups in other parts of Canada, the French language is central to identity. We also have to understand that in the United States, identity is not defined by language. Identity is defined by skin color. And we see that in all the forms that we have to fill out when we go to do some official thing, like go to the doctor or go to the DMV or whatever. There are all those little check boxes, and all those little check boxes are based on skin color and ethnicity, but none of them is based on language. So it's a very real difference when we talk to, or when I talk to researchers or talk to journalists from Canada. The idea of linguistic identity simply does not exist in the United States. The idea of linguistic rights does not exist in the United States because of the way that we're programmed in a racially divided society. So language is not the thing that ties us together, which is another huge challenge in the work that we do, trying to bring people from these disparate groups together to work on language issues and language policy. The other thing that we can look at is that there's a real correlation between heritage language laws and coastal erosion. So everything that you see in red there on that image used to be land, but now it's water or it's marshland. And these are regions where there are historically large populations of French and Creole speaking people. And when they're dispersed from their communities and from the people that they know, because you've got rising sea levels and you've got hurricane damage and things like that, the language is also dispersed and they go more into English speaking spaces and they don't maintain their language. So you'll see there that in 1970, the US Census counted around 1 million people in Louisiana who were speaking a variety of French or Creole. They represented at that point between 1/3 and 1/4 of the population. There was even talk in the early days of the French Renaissance movement in the late 60s and early 1970s that Louisiana, there was fear in the legislature of Louisiana and even talk in the US Congress that Louisiana might become another Quebec. There are newspaper articles about that, actually. And so it's interesting to also see that that's kind of when we begin to notice this divergence of these two labels, Creole for Afro-descended people and Cajun for white people. Because if those 1 million people have been able to come together around a language identity, they would have represented an economic and political power that would have, in many ways, destabilized the status quo that existed. So we begin to see there that who controls the language also really controls the historic and the contemporary narrative, because the dominant language is a political and an economic tool. Um, Here's another illustration of the simple diversity historically and contemporarily of the Franco-Creolophone populations in Louisiana. So there are Native people, there are white people, there are Afro descendants. And if I'll send this over to Eric so he can distribute it for you. When you go and you click on these, you can hear these people speaking French and speaking Creole. The Dictionary of Louisiana French was published in 2010. It's the result of more than 30 years of research on the ground in different communities in Louisiana, and you see as spoken in Cajun, Creole, and American Indian communities. And what's interesting in there is not only is the word recorded, but also illustrative sentences with those words. And there's a key that tells you in which parish those words were collected. The lady down in the bottom left there, where it says Afro descendants, was a songkeeper. She had a repertoire of more than 100 songs from the 18th and 19th centuries that she sings. And there's all these really, really cool ballads and things like that. But I encourage you to go and listen to the way that she sounds when she speaks French, because it's you you can't put an ethnic label on the way that she speaks French. It's just simply French. Um, Today, we have more than 40 immersion schools. There are about 6,000 students in these immersion schools. We have roughly 30,000 high school students in French as a second language classrooms versus more than 80,000 in Spanish. Um, our We have lots of challenges here. One of our biggest challenges, I would say, is that we've done a pretty good job historically in the education sector about talking about French. And there was obviously in the late 60s, early 70s, up through the 1980s, a lot of work done to promote French as part of our heritage, our culture, and things like that. What we have not done well at all, I will say, what we have absolutely face planted in is positioning French as a language of economic development and French as a professional language. Um, Spanish is a language of consumerism. French is not, which is why we see Spanish really ramping up and taking over, and we lose numbers of French programs every year. Um, in some of the most French-speaking places in the state, there are no French classes in the high school anymore. There's only Spanish offered because it's a language of consumerism. So we don't consume services, we don't consume products in French. So French people are completely invisible. French-speaking people are completely invisible in the marketplace. Spanish speaking people are not. And so this is why we get Press 2 for Spanish, and this is why we get signs in Walmart and McDonald's and everywhere else in Spanish. And that's because Spanish speakers consume products and services in Spanish, and French speakers do not. Um, there are lots of young people now who either going through immersion programs or going through French as a second language programs who are saying things like, I love immersion programs, but what is there for young people after? Without losing the progress we made, we need to find social settings where we can speak French, social settings and also professional settings. Um, there is a lot of technology now, and that's helped in many, many ways to not only explain what Louisiana French and Louisiana Creole are, but there are also online courses and things like that where you can go and you can hear the way that these languages are spoken, and you can take classes and you can do all kinds of things with them. Um, there is a huge, huge, huge documentary un fonds documentaire, je sais pas dire en français, but lots of archives that are written and also audio and video archives in universities here in Louisiana and even elsewhere that give us a really rich really rich resources in the plural for hearing how these languages have been spoken over time, how they've evolved, how they also have been eroded by English. Because if you would go to a certain parish today and talk to someone who speaks French, and you compare that with someone from the same parish who spoke French 50 years ago, there's a marked difference in their fluency levels and a marked difference in their comfortability in speaking French and in their ability to manipulate the language and use tenses and accords and all those things that go with grammar. And that just has to do with the dominance of English, and also the fact that because French is not spoken anymore in the homes or in other settings, it's not being transitioned or transmitted in the way that we would like to see it. There's a Louisiana French program at the Louisiana State University. The only French language maison d'édition or publishing house in the United States is at Centenary College in West Louisiana. And they publish not only the 19th century literature that was written in French in Louisiana, they're also publishing modern authors as well. They have the droit d'auteur, or the right to publish the newest Zachary Richard novel. This is the first novel written in French in Louisiana since 1895. So it's a pretty big deal. There are lots and lots and lots of discussion groups on Facebook about Louisiana French, about Cajuns, about Creoles, and all of that, filled with lots and lots of mythology, I will add, and as are most kinds of online fora. There's some really good music now being produced by young Louisiana artists. The Sweet Crew Band is one of them. They perform in Louisiana French and Louisiana Creole, and they're not even 30 years old yet. So, that's a really good way for transmitting language and transmitting culture. Télé Louisiane, which some of you might be familiar with, produces a weekly TV show on Louisiana Public Television. They also do interviews and things like that, which you can find on their online platform, which is telelouisiane.com. La Creole Show, we've got the young Tali Pierre Auguste, who's a Creole language activist. He self-publishes stories in Louisiana Creole as well. And so if you're interested in seeing what the language looks like in written form, you can see it right there. I will point out that Louisiana Creole and Louisiana French are now recognized as separate languages. They're not deformations one or the other. They are separate languages. And the Louisiana Creole language developed obviously in plantation spaces of enslavement, where you had different linguistic groups of African people whose languages were clashing with the colonial varieties of French that were spoken to give birth to this new Creole language as we know it in Louisiana. Another of our great social media superstars is Jordan Thibodeau. He does a lot of really good music. He does little videos on Instagram and TikTok where he tells little stories and anecdotes. We have also a French culture film grant that is produced by the Louisiana Endowment for the Humanities, also with Coda Film. And we're really lucky to have a partnership with TV5 Monde, which gives money to help produce that. And so this is a really sought after grant. So there are things happening where people have access to do creative work in French in Louisiana, and they can also find some funding for that. A really fun thing was done, this movie called Film Quest in 2021 between the New Foundation and Sam Kraft. That's actually available on YouTube, so you guys can go watch and check that out. It's a lot of fun. This organization, chambo.org, was created a couple of years ago. It's all about the Louisiana Creole language. And there you have learning resources and things like that. So obviously the website's in both French and in English. Bonjour Louisiane, KRVS is the public radio station from Lafayette, and they do early morning radio in Louisiana French, and they also have a program all day on Sunday where they're broadcasting in Louisiana French and Louisiana French music. Um, this is interesting to look at because we hear this all of the time in Louisiana. My grandparents spoke French, my great grandparents spoke French, but they didn't teach us. And when people say that today, that can mean lots of things. It can mean that they might have spoken French or they might have spoken Louisiana Creole. And if we just look at this, we can see some examples of what that looks like and what these sort of variations are. And sometimes you might come across someone who will say that they speak French, but they actually speak Creole. And you have to really hear what they're saying, but you also have to be able to speak both of these languages to then continue in a conversation. Sometimes there can be a mixture of the two, where you'll find people who will say mot for je, and then the next sentence will say je, and they just weave back and forth between these varieties. There are lots and lots of myths and misperceptions out there, and these have been carried over from the time that English was imposed. So you hear people say that Louisiana French is a broken language. We hear that all the time. That Louisiana French is only spoken by Cajuns, that it was only an oral language, that it cannot be written, that it's different from international French, that it was illegal. And we know with documentation, we know with literature, we know with Gazette newspapers, that there were French language newspapers published in every parish in South Louisiana in French until the late 19th and early 20th centuries. So you can say, so if French was only an oral language in Louisiana, who was reading the newspapers? Who was writing the articles? Who was buying the ads in the newspapers? But people forget very easily. It only takes one generation to forget things, right? And just because one person's grandparents were illiterate in French doesn't mean the other person's were. And we could also say that before public education became obligatory in 1916, that English was only an oral language in Louisiana as well, because the illiteracy rates were pretty much on par between French speakers and English speakers. But this also comes back to this idea of having a different perception about French than we do for English, because nobody ever says that English was only an oral language. It's easier to say that French was. This illustration that you have right there, the image is from La Sentinelle de Thibodaux, si j'ai bonne mémoire, from 1897. Thibodaux is in Le Fourche parish, which is Thibodaux in that area. It's written in normative French, but this recipe for gumbo is written in Creole. And that's because the author of the article wanted, it's a literary device, wanted the readers to know that there was an old black lady telling how to fix this gumbo. In the same way that if you've read Huckleberry Finn or Tom Sawyer, those things, when Mark Twain voices Jem, or he voices Afro-descended people, he uses what we now call AAV, African American Vernacular English, which was then called Negro dialect, to voice them. This is the same literary device, but it shows you, obviously, that people could not only write in Creole, they could also read in Creole. And this is written in a very conversational voice, where you've just got this lady telling you how to fix a gumbo and telling you what to put in the pot. And a couple of times in there, she says, "Oh, I forgot to tell you this. I forgot to tell you that." And at the very, very end, she says, "M'oublier, il faut manger li avec du riz." So she forgot to say that you have to eat it with rice. And so, the same things happen between Louisiana French and the Creole language. Another of them is that it was derived from Haitian Creole. That's not true. Louisiana Creole developed independently of Haitian Creole, even though there was a huge influx of people from Saint-Domingue into Louisiana in the early 19th century. Um, so one of the things I say all the time is, I said this earlier, like jazz and gumbo, these are our heritage languages. We need to talk about them as a cultural birthright and present them as such. Um, I've got lots and lots of things here, and it's a lot. But let's come back to some of the challenges. So I think the biggest ones are, how do we overcome this racial segregation between whites, blacks, and native people? And how do we change our language and our relationship? Why don't we say langue d'héritage instead of langue étrangère? Again, because whoever controls the language is also controlling the historic and the contemporary narrative. And how do we bring people in Louisiana who speak one of these languages toward a political project that would really, really bring us toward social, educational, professional, and economic uses of these languages? And of course, le nerf de la guerre is always le financement. Money is always the problem. So anyhow, I'll just finish up with this. The French language is one of the most clean, renewable natural resources in Louisiana, but it's also the most undeveloped. So there we go. I think that does it. I'll
And
start at the top.
go through.
How did Anglophone, Catholic Irish, and German speaking Catholic Germans fit into the Creole American dichotomy? Um, it kind of depended on what time they arrived and where they went. In New Orleans, for example, we had a very checkerboard city. There is a corner still today in New Orleans where there, like it's a how do you call that? Like a an intersection. That's what I'm looking for. There is a historically German Catholic church on one corner, a historically Sicilian Catholic church on the other, and an Irish church on the other, and they all look at each other. So people tended as immigrant communities to stay together. If they went out into the countryside, depending upon where they went, oftentimes they would have been integrated in. Um, a lot of people don't realize that New Orleans, up until the 1920s, was after New York and San Francisco, one of the largest ports of entry for immigrants into the United States. So the city of New Orleans was a very cosmopolitan and very metropolitan city with German neighborhoods, with Irish neighborhoods, with the Croatian neighborhoods, with Sicilian neighborhoods. But keep in mind also that we have to sometimes flip our perspective of these things, right? Because when those people immigrated to the United States, they came here to become American. That was, for many of them, the goal, to come and to assimilate. You also have to understand that for the people who were already here, the border crossed them, right? So assimilation was forced upon them. It wasn't something that they chose, right? So when we talk about this idea of how people were historically resisting the what was called by some people in the 19th century le rouleau compresseur américain, the American steamroller, which was westward expansion and manifest essay and all of that, they were trying to maintain the identity they already had, right? So lots of times we have to flip the way that we understand how things are happening, because we talk about and we learn actually in Louisiana schools that thing that happened in 1803 was the Louisiana Purchase, or that we bought Louisiana from the United States. But for the people who were here, it was quite the opposite. They were sold to the United States. But that then gets into a huge question of how we address identity, right? Because when we say in Louisiana, we were sold to the United States, then that is a rejection in many ways of American identity. So it becomes very, very, very tricky in political and economic spaces when you do that. Hashtag see Quebec, hashtag see Acadian identity, or minority French speaking identities that resist Anglophonization in Canada. So it's an interesting concept to play with. Um, is Haitian Creole similar or identical to the New Orleans Creole? I think I addressed that already. They were probably mutually comprehensible in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. Today, they're not. Because for one, Haitian Creole has continued to develop. Louisiana Creole has been kind of I don't want to say frozen in time, but it didn't continue to develop in the way that Haitian Creole has. Just because of English came in and sort of froze it a little bit. How did people in Louisiana feel when Macron visited? It was a presidential visit. There was lots of enthusiasm around it. There were about 250 of us at the big reception where he spoke. Um, it got a lot of press coverage. I don't know that people understood. I don't think that the English speaking people in Louisiana, even those of them of French heritage, understood the significance or understood that him doing his speech in French at the New Orleans Museum of Art was a political statement for Louisiana. Uh, because everywhere else he goes, he always speaks in English when he does his speeches. When he's in an English speaking space, he did his speech in French in New Orleans. And those kinds of subtle little things go completely over the heads of people who aren't in the mindset of a minority linguistic group that is trying to not, I hate the word preservation, but is trying to develop the language or trying to find uses for it and things like that. But when I worked in the technology, French is a crucial language in the global industry. Of course it is. However, coming back to this idea of how we've not done a really good job of positioning French as a language of economy and a language of professionalization, you cannot go to a single solitary university in Louisiana and even do a hotel, restaurant, or tourism course in French. Our universities remain completely focused on 19th century French literature, French philosophy, and French has been maintained in our university spaces as a very elitist, inaccessible thing. Like in New England, French here was spoken by a certain elite, but it was also spoken by the regular agricultural people, right? So it was a working class language here in the same way that it was in some spaces a more elite commercial language or political language. Our university systems, unfortunately, have promoted French as very European and have also promoted it as very elitist. Um, and it projects an image of inaccessibility, right? It doesn't project an image of okay, I can speak French and I can go work on tractors in Africa, or I can go to Canada and work in forestry. Or is this making sense at all? So the idea of the démocratisation du français, we haven't developed that at all, which is really challenging. Um, where are the immersion schools located? Immersion schools are all over the place. There are 5 in New Orleans. There are several. There are lots of in. There's 2 or 3 in North Louisiana, believe it or not. There's some in Baton Rouge. They're kind of all over the place. Keep in mind, though, for those of you who might be familiar with the sort of tripartite Canadian system, where you have English schools, French schools, and immersion schools. In Louisiana, there is no quote unquote French school or a French curriculum, right? It doesn't exist. So we have 2 schools in New Orleans that are French curriculum, like from France. Okay, so they use the French curriculum in those schools. The others of them are Louisiana curriculum taught in French. So when the teachers arrive, what they have to do is take the curriculum and translate it into French. And for anybody who is remotely connected to education, you know that it's very political, curricula change every 2 years. And so it's a constant rotation and work to try to create resources and materials for the classrooms. It's a lot of work for the teachers who are brought in. Um, I'm really interested in the idea and have talked with academics a lot about this. If you look at a French language curriculum in Acadie, Quebec, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, there's French language identity building is in the curriculum. Okay. In order to do that in Louisiana would be a political minefield because how do you, in a very very conservative political atmosphere that is South Louisiana, work on something that could be perceived and that would be perceived as anti-American or anti-patriotic, right? So, example, the Louisiana Purchase. We bought Louisiana from France, but if our school children are learning we were sold to the United States, then that becomes just from the donc on a les mots la vente de la Louisiane, okay, is a different political, economic identity perspective than l'achat de la Louisiane. So you can see how this could get very complicated. At what age do children start immersion programs? Immersion is going to start depending upon it's not standardized. It's not a perfect model that's the same one all over the place. Some of them might start in pre-K. The École Bilingue in New Orleans has a crèche, so they can start at 3 years old there. But that's a private school. Most of them are going to start either at kindergarten or first grade. And what happens is that you'll have a full classroom at 25, 30 kids. There's a lot of attrition that happens because by the time, in most cases, they get to fifth or sixth grade, that number's cut in half or even more. Because as children progress through their early childhood education or elementary education, that's when you're going to also start noticing that there are learning disabilities, that you need all these different kinds of 504 plans, individual education and plans, and all that kind of stuff. And that can only happen in English because you don't have any resource people, speech pathologists, or interventionists who are trained to work in a bilingual setting or trained to do or offer those services in target language. We also run into the thing that by the time they get to eighth grade, which is when most of the immersion programs end, they don't extend to high school except there's Lafayette High School, which is one high school, and the Lycée Français de la Nouvelle-Orléans. Elsewhere, immersion ends in sixth, seventh, or eighth grade, depending upon the school. And there's no follow-up into high school because as we lose French as a second language programs in high schools, there's no reinforcement in high school to maintain them in language. By the time they get to university, if and our university professors are not at all trained either to adapt to students who've come through immersion schools, because there's just lots of holes in the system. It's great we pat ourselves on the back for all these immersion schools, but most of the kids who go through them are not able to maintain their French. My daughter was in immersion school for 3 years, from third grade to seventh grade. And the only reason that she still speaks French is because that's the only language that she and I speak together. And she works in French with me at Laura Plantation doing tours. Like, we speak French actively. All of her classmates, none of her classmates who were in immersion with her speak French at home, and none of them speaks French now. So they're in their early 20s. They've lost all of their French. They can say bonjour, and that's pretty much it. But when was Macron came to Louisiana? That was in December of 2022, I think. Yeah, December 10th, 2022. How I learned to speak French. French was lost in my family a couple of generations before I came along. My grandparents had very, very good friends from South Louisiana who spoke French with the couple spoke French amongst themselves. They did not speak French to their children, who were a little bit older than I was. the grandmother in that family was a monolingual French speaker. And I thought it was fascinating that the woman could not speak with her own grandparents because they didn't speak the same languages. I just thought that was fascinating because I've always been a nerd. And then when I was in fourth grade, we had teachers come to my elementary school who were from Switzerland, and it was kind of almost like a genetic memory for me because I'm a nerd and I believe in that kind of stuff. But like I've spoken French pretty much fluently since I was 7 or 8 years old, just because it just clicked for me. Um, in New Orleans, which again was a very cosmopolitan city, um, the French spoken in the city was always very metropolitan. It does not sound like what you hear in the videos because all of the most of the research that's been done on French in Louisiana has really focused on rural varieties and on things that were not considered sort of normal everyday French, which was what was always spoken in the city. So there aren't very many recordings actually of French speakers in the city because it wasn't considered different enough. It was just French. So it's a kind of missing thing because there would have been I've found two actually, and there are some interesting accent things going on. There are some interesting words that are used to describe things, but finding good recordings of people speaking French in the city don't really exist. I've not yet found a recording of someone speaking Creole from the city. We do have recordings of people singing in Creole from the city. So that's always fun to listen to as well to see how they were, what words they were using, how they were describing things, and how that compares to the Creoles that are more well documented from the countryside.
Okay. Well, right. Excuse me. You're the one who's talking. I'm the one who lost my voice. The Wonderful. If there are no more questions in the chat, we could sit around. I'm sure many of us
I'm
sit around and talk about this stuff forever.
I am perfectly fine to hang out for a little while. I don't have
Yeah.
anything
If
else on my
there's
schedule this evening. So if you guys
yeah
want to chat, we can
yeah. If there's
on peut
any
parler en français si vous voulez, en anglais, ça
yeah.
m'est
If
égal.
there are people who would like to chime in and unmute themselves and ask questions or bring up points, feel free to do so. Um, I think you will you would just come on if you do that. Otherwise, uh, this is truly wonderful. I heard you give a version of this talk, I guess last year when you do it through AFUSA.
Mhm.
Um, and it really helps to be reminded and filled out with all of it. It really from a cultural point of view, as well as a linguistic point of view, as well as whatever interest we have in French. It's it's it, it, it's not only an amazing story, but it is also it's something that is very real today. And we're Quebec is right north of us, and there are a number of people in the audience who are are either Quebecois or have recent Quebecois ancestors, and there are many parallels, but there are also obviously a whole lot of differences as well. And so this is all part and parcel of our linguistic mosaic. And I really appreciate it, and we all do. And um, uh, thank you very much. Thank you very much for
Euh,
to take the time to
Merci.
go through this for us.
So if I'm open to questions, chat, whatever you guys want to do. If you'd like to stick around, so
Yep, I don't see anything showing up, so I think we all need to kind of chew on it and think about it.
it's
Uh,
a lot.
yeah, and your email is in the PowerPoint, and so I assume that people can further questions whatever by email as they wish.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Donc, merci infiniment tout le monde. Donc, bonne soirée. Et bon, si vous avez besoin de quoi que ce soit, des questions, vous les discutez après, hein, vous avez mes coordonnées, donc n'hésitez pas.
Bon, merci beaucoup
Merci.
de la part de tout le monde et de notre petite alliance française ici à Vermont.
Bah, je suis ravi
Voilà.
d'avoir été là. Merci beaucoup. Bonne
Oui.
soirée. Au revoir.
Merci à vous.
Oui, bonsoir. Au revoir.
Bonsoir.